Hello and welcome to Sensei podcast. This is Manos Pilakis discussing with leaders in the field of CTO and complex PCI. Sensei means teacher or master in Japanese. The goal of the Sensei podcast is to help you learn and improve in CTO and complex PCI so that you can become the best that you can be and offer your patients the best possible results. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sensei Podcast. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Ram Vijayaraghavan from the Scarborough Health Network in Toronto, Canada, a great CTO operator, the organizer of an amazing Canadian CTO meeting, and a great friend. Ram, thanks so much for joining us today.
Manos, it's such an honor to be here, especially when asked by someone whom I respect so much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Ram, you've done a phenomenal work, and you're active in many avenues of CTO and complex PCI, but maybe we'll start from the beginning. How did it all start? How did you get into the area of complex CTO PCI?
Yeah, I think we are all shaped by so many things in our lives that go back, and I think that it's become a perfect fit for my personality. So when I think back as a child, I always wanted to do something fundamental. Both my parents were physicians. My father had this strange feeling that he wasn't going to live a very long time, although he's now a practicing physician at the age of 79, so he's done very well. But his family was replete with diabetes. Like everyone had diabetes. He got it young. And he would say these strange things when we talked about the future that he only wanted to, he thought, I'm not living past 50. And it always percolated in my mind. And I thought, why does this have to be like this? And for me, it imbued my desire to go into medicine, not only just following in my father's footsteps, but also trying to understand how to make people do better longer and live longer. I think that's always been with me. So going into medicine, I wasn't the person who's going to go into a field that wasn't about critical problems like cardiac or ICU. These are the types of things that I was interested in. The second thing I think is, in Canada, and I think in a lot of places, at least in the last 15 years of my practice, CTO has been kind of an outsider's field. It's not mainstream PCI. It's only evolving that way with the efforts of people like yourself and others who are trying to bring it into more mainstream techniques. And so I've always felt like an outsider. So when I was growing up as a brown kid in Winnipeg in the 80s, it was a very interesting environment. Racism was alive and well. And but there are also wonderful people there as well, and so I never entirely fit in, and I've been that way throughout my career, and I'm actually not entirely uncomfortable in that circumstance of not fitting in. I'm okay being a little bit uncomfortable. So, and the third aspect I think is I'm quite happy to learn things and get rid of them. So there's this concept that I've learned recently of this called the sunk cost fallacy, which I've been practicing my whole life without really understanding the philosophy behind it because I'm not really that attuned to what I'm doing, like most people. So when I trained, obviously I went through internal medicine and cardiology in Toronto, and I went into interventional cardiology, but I had the opportunity after 1 year of interventional at Sunnybrook Hospital to do a year of cardiac MRI and then do some research in animal research, which I'd never really done before. And so I spent a year doing cardiac MRI. I got certified in that, and I loved it. I learned cardiac CT. And so when I came out, thinking about what job to take, I had options that were, I could be a cardiac MRI researcher and develop a pig model of infarct and do all that, or I could, go to the community and practice clinical cardiology. And, at that point, I basically gave up on the concept that I was going to be a fundamental researcher. My wife decided that for me. She said, when you come home after looking after pigs, you're not happy. And when you come home after looking after patients on your regular angioplasty day, you're thrilled and excited about what you've done. So I'm telling you, this is what you're going to do. So I chose the path to go into a community center, which is in Scarborough in East Toronto, a little bit outside again, right? Not a primary academic center in Toronto, not where all the action was. And I went to the outside, but I got a chance to practice all these things, MRI, CT. I did internal medicine call at the same time as doing angioplasty call when I started. So I had all this knowledge and training that I wanted to use. But what I've done over the years is just even if I love something, you always got to give something up if you want to pick something up. Yeah, so I was practicing this hospital without surgical backup, and but I was loving it. Like, I was looking after patients from every walk of life. We have a wonderful patient population in the east end of Toronto. Lots of immigrants, lower socioeconomic status, just wonderful, grateful people. And so I was looking after this one gentleman who's in his mid 40s, had multivessel disease, and I offered him PCI, and that's what he preferred. And so I completely messed up the CTO of his LAD. This was in 2010, before I really had any interest. And I was one of those operators. I thought I was okay. I've never been someone who's generally overconfident with their skills. And But I did see some of my friends learning how to do CTO, and I thought, this is a bit crazy. I was still one of those people who said, this is a bit too much. Why are we doing all that? And then I tried to do it, and I learned a lesson there that uh, that was one case where I first saw my limits. Right, like, there's clearly someone else who can do this better than I could, and the consequences are not great for the patient. So we dissected the LAD. He did okay. He went for a bypass, but it was a suboptimal result, right? Like, you can't bypass an LAD that is torn all the way to the apex. And sure enough, the graft didn't last. And he suffered with angina for years. And I tend not to run away from situations like that. So I kept looking after him. So he would come to my office every 3 or 6 months. We'd play with his medications, and I would remind myself, of my failure and of my mistake. And maybe I'm a bit masochistic, but I would, you know, you beat yourself over the head with that from time to time. It can be good and it can be bad for you. But in this case, it really, that moment galvanized me to realize that I had to keep learning and I had to do something new. So, at that point, we didn't have a lot of equipment. We didn't have rotablator. We're doing PCI without any imaging at all. We had no IVUS except for research for cases. So, um, my partner and mentor, Dr. Chris Lee, and I just decided that we're going to get everything. So we're in a situation where we don't have a lot of hemodynamic support. We have very sick patients, large volumes of cardiogenic shock, and complex cases, and we needed everything. So we got everything within a space of 1 or 2 years: OCT, IVUS, physiology, rotablator, and we spent some time getting comfortable with all those technologies first. Um, and we'd go to the meetings and we'd learn from people like yourselves and other great colleagues, but we didn't get into CTO until we went to CTO Summit. And I think this is a common story amongst people of my vintage. That meeting should never stop, because I feel like it's often a moment of inspiration where you realize that there's an entire community around this type of PCI. And the eye-opening moment was when I saw a case. I don't know who was doing it. It might have been Bill, of a case of ADR, where I started to understand that dissection and subintimal space were things that could be utilized. And that is a eureka moment for the non-CTO operator, because, and it's still, I see this frequently as we do teaching now in our conferences and so on, that people are still shocked by this idea. And to me, that was like the moment that I felt that we can do this. And then it was still another year before we gathered all the equipment. I talked to colleagues and tried to figure out what we needed. And then another conference, and then we decided to go ahead with our CTO program.
So you got the inspiration. There was clearly a big clinical need. You had a busy program and a lot of patients in need, and you had the case you mentioned. But then you got inspired from the meeting, which is great. But then from going from there to actually learning how to do it, how did you go about it? Did you have people come help you? Did you buy books, meetings? How did you actually learn how to do these techniques?
Yeah, so I would say watching live cases at the CTO Summit and at other conferences was helpful, just to give a broader perspective on the different ways of doing things, and little things like how you get proper support for these type of procedures, dual angiography, and the value of the setup and the planning. Like, those are the useful lectures and tidbits that I got out of the meetings. And then we went to watch people. So we would go to Chris Buller's lab at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. He's been an incredible supporter and mentor. We'd watch them do cases and get a good understanding. And then finally we said, we just got to do this. Like, we just got to get our hands on it and do it. I didn't have the opportunity. I'm not even sure there were fellowships in this at that point, or maybe they were just starting. And I didn't have the chance because at that point I already had a mortgage and kids. So that wasn't happening for me. So we had got all the equipment, and the moment of jumping in was when we had to buy the Bridgepoint devices. I don't know if you know what it was like in Canada at that point, but they were just being marketed by Boston, and you had to buy a bunch of them up front, which was a significant capital investment for the hospital. And so we galvanized the hospital around the program, said, we're going to do this. This is what it costs, and then we're going to get going. And they're going to bring a proctor up. And so for us in this region, it was going to be Chris Buller, and he was a friend and colleague. And so we had him come up and do one day where we lined up ADR cases. And I think we did 2 ADRs and 1 antegrade wire escalation. And then we spent 6 months practicing that. So we, in a small volume, right? So we'd had a CTO day maybe once every month or once every couple of weeks, and we'd line up cases and we would focus on that. We wouldn't do retrograde because we weren't comfortable with it. And then after 6 months of doing a mixture of antegrade wiring and ADR, and by no means were we fully comfortable with any of this stuff at that point. Okay, like, your level of comfort is much lower. We then had Chris come up for a retrograde day. So we lined up a few cases for retrograde, and then we had a proctorship that day. We did, I think, it turned out to be 1 retrograde and 1 antegrade, and everything went well. And that's it, right? And I maybe had 1 or 2 other proctors since then, but the learning has been very different since then. It's been doing cases, talking to colleagues, showing them the complications, showing them the failures, and learning. And one thing that I've realized over the years is that, and I learned this from my mentor, is that you don't need a huge volume of cases to get really good. The threshold for becoming really good at angioplasty is much less than what we actually think it is. Like, in Canada, as you know, like, we have very few angioplasty centers and very few physicians who do coronary angioplasty. So, being a low volume operator in this country does no less than 200 PCIs. That's considered low. Like, the average would be, like, in the community anyways, would be 300 plus, an inordinate amount of angiography and complex other stuff. But you don't need that much to get good. And if I look at the landscape of the way our country is, some of the best operators have done less and learned more with less. So my partners and we do this in partnership in Toronto a lot. And I think that was pushed forward by Chris Buller, actually, the way he kind of set things up. So my partner is Chris Lee, and he's also my mentor in PCI really over my entire career. And he's not really, like, your mentors can be younger than you or older than you, I think. He's not really much older than me. I realize that now, but when I started, he was like 5-6 years older, and he seemed like, oh my goodness, this person knows everything. He helps me with everything. He can bail me out of any complication. And so he's always functioned in that role, but we're much more, I guess, equal now, but I still obviously see him in a different way. So he, was always of the mind that he, didn't want to overwork himself. He had a family. He was, looking after kids, but he would take every case and learn from every piece of information that you could get out of a case. So understanding wire behavior, understanding the behavior of the microcatheters in different circumstances, the nuances around support from the radial versus the femoral versus 6 versus 8 French. He got all that stuff because he's just very analytical about each and every case. And so I learned that we could do that. So we were doing 30, 40 CTO cases a year back in 2012, 2013, 2014. Doesn't sound like much, but we would sink our teeth into every single case, learn whatever we could, share whatever we could with colleagues, and then gradually kind of built up from there in a very incremental way. And not starting with the crazy stuff, but now I guess we've ended in with the more advanced cases now.
Perfect. So, and I think what you just mentioned, having a partner, does help a lot, both with logistics and the stress of the procedure but also on the learning, as you mentioned. So are you doing all your cases together or the CTO cases together? How does that work in your program?
Yeah. So most of them are together. We've hired a third CTO operator for our program. I think we have a reasonable volume now, but we we have a role for two operators at the table. We also will sometimes have a fellow. So it's an interesting setup where one person might be in the control room looking at the case and kind of coming up with ideas, and then you'll have an operator and a fellow at the table, or some combination thereof. And you know, there's numerous advantages to this. Like, number one, like the obvious disadvantage is from an income standpoint. It's like, this is pro bono work. I think we all understand that with what we do here. It's the way it works in Canada is unfortunately remuneration is really around volume, but that's okay. We do very well, and we do this because we love it. So that is the only disadvantage in my opinion. The rest of it is, number one, it's way more fun. Like, we have a lot of enjoyment on they're our happiest days in the cath lab, and it increases our enjoyment of our work. And number two, like, there's a difference between the person who's actually doing the physical work and the second person who's thinking about the next step. So and you can easily morph between those two roles, and we have the luxury of doing that. So that's what I find is particularly advantageous. Like, I'll be busy perseverating on something, but I move a lot faster when my partner tells me, well, we've done enough of this, we're moving on to that, the next wire's on deck, move on, like, so on and so forth. So I find it extremely helpful. It's fun, and I think it's more effective. And obviously, when you have a complication, you have all the hands on deck that understand how to deal with the problem. And we can call for help, but everyone's already in the room, so we're ready to go.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I think more and more programs are able to do that despite the limitations that you just mentioned. Ram, how do you deal with the challenges, the failures, the complications? That's something that happens to everyone. How do you deal with this, and how has that changed over the years that you've been doing this procedure?
Yeah, there's two things. One is failure and mistakes, and the other one are complications, I think, because they have significantly different impacts. So I'll talk about failure and mistakes first. So I don't think that you can really do this, CTO, PCI in particular, unless you have a good relationship with failure and mistakes. So if every failure and mistake is really going to damage your ego, then this is not a great field for you. It's not the 99.9% success rate of regular PCI, or even complex PCI for that matter. So I, like I said earlier, like, everyone has an ego. I don't want to say I don't have an ego, but um, I've always been comfortable not being the best, not being the absolute expert. And I feel that if I ever truly get to the point where I fully know something, I'm going to get bored, and I'm going to want to move on. And so I don't mind being uncomfortable. And I think that's the context in which I approach failure and mistakes. It doesn't feel good when I go into a case that I think is a JCTO 1 or 2, and we're not successful. And that happens, right? That happens to all of us for various reasons that we can't predict. The support isn't as good as you thought, etc. But I've had enough of those experiences that I'm comfortable with that, and I know what I'm going to learn from that and what I'm going to take to the next problem. The second thing that really helps with that is being able to talk it through with your team. So, like I said, we work in partners, and the failure is also shared, as are the successes, right? So it diffuses the responsibility, but it also diffuses the discussion, and we make a plan together for how we're going to approach this patient, discuss with them, and go to the next procedure for them to improve their success. So the team approach helps, and this general feeling that you're not a perfect expert in everything, and it's okay to make mistakes. The complication side is, I think, much more challenging, right? So, you've been in practice a very long time. I've had devastating complications, right? So anything from minor things that I'm very happy to have dealt with, and horrible things. And I'll bring up one scenario because it's personal, but it also was transformative in the way I approach complications. This was a little bit earlier on, pre-CTO days. I had a case of a young man in his mid-30s who had a family and who came in with a myocardial or an RCA infarction. He had an angiogram done a couple of days prior, and his RCA was completely full of thrombus. So one of my colleagues parked him in our coronary care unit and gave integralin and 2B3A inhibitor and heparin and tried to marinate him and think like, what are we going to do with this? And he kept having angina in the unit. So I was asked to take him back to the lab after about 48 hours and hopefully then open the artery if it's less with less thrombus. But the subtext for this person is his personal life, right? So he has a wife who is, in her third trimester, okay, with their, I think, about to be their fifth child or something, okay? Lovely people, okay, whom I met and I talked to during the consent process. And, she was basically going into labor at that point, okay? And thankfully, our hospital also has a good obstetrics ward. So she was being looked after over there. And, sure enough, he's having angina, like post-MI angina, high risk situation for him. And she's going into labor. And we had this discussion, like, what do we do? And so we, the decision was made to go ahead with the procedure, understanding the personal situation. And I did the procedure. I injected the right coronary artery and identified that it was really still full of thrombus. I tried to do thrombectomy, didn't really work. And I said, look, we got to do something different here. And I'd known about the concept of giving intracoronary TPA. I can't remember if it was TPA or TNK at that point. And we looked up the doses, tried to get everything right. And, we did it. And miraculously, like it works, right? Like the artery cleared up, like it just disappeared. And, I was able to get a good result. But, it was a horrible situation because, during the case, he starts to have a headache and he had an intracranial hemorrhage on the table. Okay. Wow. And we had to intubate him on the table and get neurology and everything involved. And, it was catastrophic after that. So he's going to our ICU. We're making phone calls. We don't have neurosurgery at our hospital, so we had to transfer him out. And he has his wife who's like kind of in early labor. She hadn't delivered yet. And I went over to the obstetrics unit and got her because they couldn't transfer it over. So I brought her over to her husband's bedside to say goodbye because he needed to be transferred immediately to the neurosurgical hospital. And she couldn't talk to him. He's out at this point, intubated. And, ultimately, that was a very dramatic scenario for me. And he ultimately didn't survive. It was unfortunate. So, I learned a lot from that circumstance. And that type of, and many of us will be in circumstances like that. We don't always talk about those things, but they hit you to the core. You never, ever forget them. They become part of your life. They become part of your career. And I think we have to accept that complications aren't meant to be glossed over and learned from and just moved on from, that they do become a part of you to an extent. It's just like, can you make it something positive that you can build on and move forward? So immediately after that, of course, I felt that I wanted to leave this field. Like I didn't want to do this anymore. How can I do this? And, again, my mentor found me and took me out for a coffee and just listened to my sadness and my despair. And then, and that was enough. He didn't have to come up with a solution for me. But so what I've learned, I think, from that is when my colleagues have complications or I have complications, that you've got to talk through the emotional stuff. You can't try to push it away because pushing it away results, I think, in disaster. So that was number one. So he helped me recognize that you don't run from the emotions, but try to deal with them. And then once you've kind of integrated that, and dealt with the emotional aspect, not really dealt with, but integrated it, accepted it, and sat with it, it's at that point that you can be a little bit more analytical and put on our scientific hat and go and look at the case with your closest friends and colleagues whom you trust. So get people around you, your team who you trust, to review this with you in a non-judgmental fashion. And I learned some things about that case. And it's not that I would never give lytic again in an artery, but um, it's certainly an extremely selective thing, and you have to be very careful and so on. And we look at the situation and say, like, what are the other options here, right? Now we have penumbra, thank goodness, right? Like there are better tech. I didn't have the angiojet back then. I don't know if you remember that device,
Yeah.
but that would have been another option. And so there are things to be learned, but I find there are two aspects to complications. So over the years, that particular event has helped me kind of frame my own approach to complications, because they keep happening, unfortunately, because I'm doing complex PCI, and also how I support my colleagues and my junior colleagues in terms of how they deal with stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is tough for everyone, but I think what you just said, that sharing them is the key. If you just keep them to yourself, it's just a negative spiral. You want to talk about them, learn from them, and help you work through the issues and move on.
Yeah.
But on a more positive note, what do you do for fun? How do you keep yourself in good shape and able to function on a high level?
Yeah. Look, I love sports. I played tennis this morning at 6 o'clock. I ran home to get changed for this interview. So tennis is my primary sport and my primary love, and I'll tell you why. Like, first of all, it's associated with really good longevity, right? Like, I think you can live longer if you play tennis. There's that study. And it's a sport, it's a technical sport, right? So you have to have technical skill. So I love technical stuff. So I'm always working on the forehand, the serve. And unlike other things that you do solo, and I know you like to run, right? So you must be when I hear about a runner, I feel that they must be a very contemplative person that is very comfortable with their own thoughts, because what else do you have to think about when you're like running along, right? In tennis, the ball is coming at you. So you have to focus on that. So it's a wonderful escape. So I love that concept, right? Like you can't really think about anything for that hour other than tennis. But what I would love to do more of is be more outdoors. So every summer, I am a camper and a canoeist. I go out into the back country for a week or on trekking. No cell phone, only a sat phone. I've done this with my children. I have 3 kids, and I do 3 camping trips every summer since they were young. My youngest is 15 now, so I do a lot of camping in the summer.
Wonderful.
And so they're all comfortable with that. Being in nature, being close to trees, and wilderness is honestly to me, the most beautiful thing about being alive. And so I really love that in the summer. And then we're big skiers in the winter here in Canada. You got to find something to do in the snow. So we have a local ski hill. My kids are racers, so that's kind of the winter thing that we do. So lots of wonderful things, and a lot of it is organized around my children. My son is a great tennis player, so I play with him. My daughter's a ski coach, so I ski with her. Everyone loves camping. It's really organized around my being with my children and being active at the same time.
Wonderful. And then, do you have any favorite book or favorite movie?
Oh yeah, I saw that in your list of questions. I quickly figured I love to read. I wish I could do more, but my favorite book is probably The Museum of Innocence by Orhan Pamuk. I don't know if this author. He's a Turkish author translated into English. He's a Nobel Prize laureate, and he wrote this book, which is truly, I think, the most devastating love story perhaps ever written. Maybe I've read Anna Karenina. That's a pretty bad love story too. So, and I love that book. But this is like maybe a modern equivalent. But I love that. I love that novel. Stories of love. That's what that's what I'm interested in. In terms of movies, it's complete opposite, Manos. Like, I like escape movies. I love science fiction movies. I'm not into the cartoon or the not what I'm talking about. superhero stuff, but I love, the old Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. Like I love that stuff. So my what I read is completely different to what I watch. So give me anything science fiction and I will watch it. So my favorite movie is probably Total Recall. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but it's a classic Arnold Schwarzenegger futuristic film on Mars, and it's absolutely hilarious. Like it's a great laugh, but it's I love it.
Sounds good. So I guess you're playing action music in the cath lab as well, where you're doing the cases. So keeps you
A
going.
little bit, yeah. Yeah, the musical tastes again are also completely inconsistent. Like I like indie pop, but I also like, pretty good rock and stuff like that. So there's a mixture of everything going on.
And how many hours do you sleep every night?
Well, I have a daughter who wakes me up at 4:45 every AM to take her for
That's
swimming. Okay, so she's a dedicated swimmer, competitive swimmer. So I was up this morning again. So it's really hard to sleep more than 6 hours when your daughter's waking you up that early. But I like to sleep 7 hours at least a night, and I think that's a reasonable target for me. Anything more than that is golden, but never happens.
So Rob, you've done a phenomenal work with the educational part, the Canadian CTO meeting. That was just, I mean, just amazing. A lot of interaction, very practical, to the point, great atmosphere, great learning. What inspired you to do that, and what are your plans for the meeting going forward?
Yeah, this is the second year of the meeting, and thank you again, Manos, for coming and being a great part of it. We really appreciate your contribution, and it was really great to have you on the other end when I was doing that case. Your suggestions were perfect; they were correct, unlike some of the things that I was trying to do. No, it was great. Um, the meeting, I'm very passionate about education and learning in general for myself, but also I want to share that with my Canadian colleagues. And you know, in part of doing CTO, and what I've understood is really that it should be built around a community, right? So that we can learn faster, we can fail together, and we can move the field forward together. The other side of it is coming back to that outsider concept, is that's it's fine to be an outsider for a period of time, but it's a little bit dangerous in a way, if we remain outsiders forever, for multiple reasons. Because some of our colleagues don't understand what we're doing, they may not approve of what we're doing, they don't understand the rationale. We need to integrate the communities, I think, of general PCI and complex PCI. In Canada, everyone's doing some complex PCI. There's so many cross-pollination skills from CTO and complex, and I wanted to bring that together in a meeting for my Canadian colleagues who, have a very high baseline level of skill, but also need to know that they have a lot to learn to become contemporary. And so that was the inception of the meeting. And the second part of it was really to kind of redefine how we interact with industry. So, doing CTO, as you know, in your lab, every day a representative from industry is showing up with a new device. So try this, try that, this might work here. And I found that a very haphazard way of being introduced to new technologies that, it's fun, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work in terms of translating from, into a clinical problem. So uh, I wanted to build a meeting that is built around the clinical problems, and then our industry partners then bring the devices together. Like you'll have multiple different companies bringing their relevant devices to a workshop that deals around that clinical problem, which is then driven by the educators of the faculty like yourself and others who came to teach, but also in partnership with industry. And I feel that that kind of crosstalk needs to happen more often on that sort of one-to-one and individualistic level. So our meeting is geared at seeing how things are done by the experts, either through lectures or live cases, but then trying those things with the new technologies in models, in a workshop setting. And I think that is the unique proposition of Can CTO. And I think that leads to better uptake and translation once people go home into their usual environment and clinical practice. And so that's what I'm very interested in sharing with my Canadian and other colleagues, to help us all get better together. And as a result, I think, and this is not just me. Like I have amazing steering committee, Alison Hall, Bassem Al-Barouni, wonderful brilliant CTO operators, Sanjog Kaura, Sanjit Jolly, who are all part of this. Part of this is we've been able to build that community within Canada, and so it's accepted, I think, um, and now what I'm seeing is that there's a lot more interest amongst centers throughout the country in hiring new trainees who have CTO and complex PCI training and getting the devices and elevating some of that complex CTO work within their already very good centers. So I think that's very edifying, and that's really our goal.
Well, again, it was a phenomenal meeting, and as you said, it's very to the point, very practical, and builds a great community. I think Canadian, I mean, always people in Canada are nice, but I think the community, it was impressive. I think the interactions were very collegial, very thoughtful, very nice. Everyone felt great being there.
I'm
So,
glad.
so, so yes, congratulations again, Ram. Now, how about the future? What is next for you?
Yeah. So I'm always like within the CTO field, I'm always trying to learn something new because I'm not perfect. I'm always failing, like all of us. And so I just, my interest right now is learning how to wire again. We talked about this a little bit at Euro CTO in Istanbul, is that I've spent a lot of time learning dissection reentry techniques, whether they're antegrade or retrograde. And so I feel in a way that I've kind of given up on the wiring and the parallel wiring and uh, IBIS guided wiring and 3D wiring, which are newer approaches that are coming out of from our Asia Pacific colleagues. So that's my next goal. So at the next CAN CTO meeting, there will be workshops around 3D fluoroscopic wiring and also around IBIS wiring, taught hopefully by some master senseis from Japan whom I met at the recent CCT meeting. And uh, my plan, and I've got a couple of colleagues in Toronto are interested in learning, is to line up cases and try to learn how to do that using the techniques and getting proctored and taught. So that's my current focus, and I think that's going to bring maybe another dimension. Like when I look at success rates, we're at around 90% in North America. They're about 90% in Japan, and from what I can see of the Japanese, they're interested in ADR and knuckling and using the subintimal space now because everyone has reached their limit. And I think that we need to look at what they're doing and say, well, maybe that's the last 10% for us, is going back to the basics of wiring. It may not be that, but this is currently my purposeful practice. I can't discard it until I've learned how to do it well enough to say that, okay, this is not going to work in my hands. But that's my current plan.
Perfect. When again, always learning, always improving, getting something else. This is the hallmark, I think, for every CTO, actually for any operator trying to do something better. So Ram, again, it's been phenomenal. You've done amazing work in building a program, building a meeting. For younger people who are early in their careers or fellows who are thinking to going into the practice, what is your advice to get good and do complex PCI or whatever else field they choose to do?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. There's so many different ways to get there. So you can do a fellowship. It is also possible to train even without a fellowship if you have the right circumstance. I think that some of the key features in my career and my journey were, number one, having a community. So don't do it alone. It's not advisable to do this alone for many reasons, and I think it's way more fun, and you will learn more if you find one or two colleagues who are interested in going on the journey with you. The beauty nowadays is the community is wide. It may not be at your own center. Be open-minded. Your colleagues may be in a different country, right? And I've learned that very well over the last few years, traveling a lot to conferences and meetings, and and also experiencing the openness of people like yourself and Bill Lombardi, who are interested in mentoring people everywhere. Doesn't matter where you are. So build that community. Number one. Number two, um, uh, just don't ever think that you've got it. Don't ever think that you're perfect. Um, you know, we there's a tendency, I think, towards a lot of massaging of ego, if that's a gentle way for me to put it, in our field and in medicine in general, right? Like we're really put up on a pedestal, and I think that uh, each of us has to recognize that that is usually a blind spot for us, and we need to reduce that in order to be able to learn, right? And then just continue to find interesting things, like be passionate, enjoy, and if something is less interesting to you in your career, move on from it. It's okay. Like you can take knowledge and expertise from one area and move it into another, and that's perfectly fine. And there's only so many hours in the day, and only so many things we can do. So just be comfortable maintaining that balance, and that life is a forward journey, and you don't need to look backwards.
Perfect. Well, Ram, again, this is amazing, and you're absolutely right. There's never a destination. You always go towards somewhere, but there's always a new destination, so it keeps continuing. But as long as you do it in good company and keeping your eyes and your mind open, I think good things are going to happen. So thank you. Thanks again for taking the time today. Lots of inspiration and motivation for everyone involved. And congratulations on everything you've done, and looking forward to more success in the future.
Thank you so much, Manos. It really was a privilege. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for listening to the Sensei podcast.